There are rare moments in politics when the noise dies down, when the scripted lines, the talking points, and the polished performances are suddenly replaced with something raw and unfiltered. That was exactly what happened when Senator John Kennedy took his seat in a congressional hearing that, on paper, was supposed to be routine. Most of these hearings follow a predictable rhythm. Experts giving testimony, politicians asking rehearsed questions, and the public catching only small sound bites on the evening news. But this time was different. Kennedy was not in the mood to play along with the choreography. He had been watching cracks in the system for months: corruption, incompetence, backroom deals hidden under fancy language. And he was ready to drag it all into the light, live on camera. The room was filled with journalists, staffers, and a few cameras that were mostly there as a formality. It was supposed to be just another government session. Yet, behind the senator's calm demeanor, there was a storm brewing. He had spent weeks collecting documents, testimonies, and reports that most people would never see. He wasn't planning to tiptoe around the truth anymore. Kennedy understood something that many of his colleagues didn't dare to admit. If the American people knew what was really happening behind those closed doors, the trust in government would shatter overnight. And so, with the cameras rolling, he decided it was time. Before Kennedy even spoke, there was tension in the air. The officials giving testimony shifted in their seats, as if they already knew what was coming. They had faced senators before, but this was different. Kennedy had a reputation. He wasn't the kind of man to bury his words under jargon or political niceties. When he asked a question, he expected an answer, not a performance. And if he didn't get one, he had no problem exposing the truth himself. So, when his turn came, Kennedy leaned forward, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the room. He didn't begin with pleasantries. He didn't thank the panel for their service, or repeat a rehearsed statement for the cameras. Instead, he went straight to the heart of the issue. He asked about the billions of dollars that had been allocated to programs with little oversight. He pressed on the contracts that mysteriously went to the same companies over and over again. He demanded an explanation for why ordinary citizens were paying higher taxes, while wealthy insiders kept getting exemptions hidden in the fine print of legislation. The officials tried to deflect, as they always do. They shifted responsibility, pointed to long reports filled with technical language, and claimed that the public wouldn't understand the complexities of the system. But Kennedy wasn't having it. For every vague answer, he had a follow-up question. For every excuse, he had a document ready to counter it. Slowly, the image of a broken, self-serving machine began to unfold, one that wasn't just failing to serve the people, but actively working against them. The cameras caught every moment. What was supposed to be a standard hearing was turning into a live exposure of corruption and inefficiency at the highest levels. Kennedy's words cut to the air like a blade, leaving no room for spin. He was building a case not just against the individuals in the room, but against the very structure of power itself. And for the first time, millions of Americans watching at home realized they weren't just seeing another political performance. They were watching the system itself being ripped open, piece by piece, live on camera. The first few minutes of Kennedy's questioning already had the hearing off balance. But what came next turned the session into something no one in the room would forget. The officials sitting across from him were used to politicians asking surface-level questions. They had trained for this, preparing binders of vague explanations, leaning on phrases like within regulatory compliance or in line with budgetary projections. These words usually worked like shields, creating the illusion of accountability without revealing anything of substance. But Kennedy wasn't playing by the usual script, and those shields were about to crumble. He reached down, picked up a thin stack of papers, and held them in his hand like evidence in a courtroom. These weren't leaked documents or sensational headlines. They were government reports, released publicly but buried so deep in bureaucratic language that no ordinary citizen could ever decode them. Kennedy had done the work. He flipped through the pages, quoting directly from sections that contradicted what the officials had just said. It was a strategy designed not only to prove them wrong, but to show the American people that the truth was already in plain sight. They just hadn't been told how to see it. The officials began to stumble. One of them, a senior administrator, adjusted his glasses and repeated the phrase operational discretion, as if those two words could explain away millions of dollars gone unaccounted for. Another tried to shift blame onto a different department. But Kennedy wasn't letting them escape. He pressed harder, asking, who signed off on these expenditures? Why did the same contractor receive funds 3 years in a row despite failing to deliver results? How many ordinary workers saw their paychecks shrink while these deals were being pushed through? Each question was sharper than the last, cutting through layers of political fog. Viewers at home could feel the tension rising. For years, many Americans had suspected that their government wasn't working for them, that somewhere behind the curtain, money and influence dictated the rules. But now, with Kennedy's words broadcast live, that suspicion was being confirmed. The system wasn't just inefficient. It was designed to protect itself, to shield insiders from consequences, while leaving everyday people to carry the burden. The cracks in the armor widened when Kennedy turned the spotlight on the relationship between lawmakers and corporate lobbyists. He asked, almost casually, why certain bills contain language that seemed to be written directly by industry representatives. He cited emails, notes from legislative drafts, and even donations that lined up almost perfectly with key votes. It was a kind of pattern that had always existed in whispers, but was rarely spoken aloud in such a direct, undeniable way. The reaction in the room was immediate. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of the journalists leaned forward, sensing that this was no longer routine politics, but something far more dangerous to those in power. The officials tried to regain control, throwing out technical terms and claiming that Kennedy was oversimplifying. But the damage was done. Every attempt to deflect only made them look weaker, like generals watching their fortress walls collapse brick by brick. Kennedy's style was not one of anger or theatrics. He wasn't pounding the table or shouting for attention. Instead, his calm, almost surgical approach made every point land with devastating clarity. He exposed contradictions not with outrage, but with undeniable facts. That calmness made it all the more powerful. It felt less like political theater and more like a revelation. By the time Kennedy paused, the narrative had shifted completely. This wasn't just about one senator questioning a panel of officials. It was about the system itself, the way money flowed, the way power insulated itself, and the way ordinary citizens were left in the dark. And the cracks Kennedy had opened in that armor were only going to get wider as he pushed deeper beyond this point in the hearing. The officials were desperate. Their usual methods, stalling, jargon, and shifting blame, weren't working. The old playbook had failed. The cameras weren't just recording a politician asking tough questions. They were documenting the collapse of a carefully built illusion. For decades, government hearings had been designed to give the appearance of transparency while protecting the machinery of power. But Kennedy had turned that design inside out. One of the officials, clearly rattled, tried a bold move. He leaned into the microphone and attempted to paint Kennedy as misinformed, suggesting that the senator had misread the documents he was quoting. It was a gamble. If Kennedy faltered, the narrative could flip back in their favor. But Kennedy didn't falter. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, let the silence stretch for a moment, and then calmly reread the passage word for word, pointing out how the official's own statement contradicted it directly. The room went still. The spin had failed, and everyone watching knew it. That moment mattered because it shattered the illusion of expertise. Too often, officials rely on complexity as a shield. If the system seems too technical, too layered with bureaucracy, the public is conditioned to believe that only the experts can understand it. Kennedy destroyed that shield in real time. He showed that the truth wasn't complicated. It was deliberately hidden under mountains of unnecessary language. By stripping it down to plain words, he made the system's failures visible to everyone. The ripple effect was immediate. Journalists in the room began typing furiously, recognizing that this wasn't just a hearing. It was history unfolding live. Viewers at home flooded social media with clips, sharing Kennedy's pointed questions and the officials' stumbling answers. The story began spreading faster than the system could contain it. For once, the people weren't hearing about corruption weeks later through filtered headlines. They were seeing it live, unedited, undeniable. Kennedy then shifted gears. He asked about accountability, not vague reviews or recommendations, but names. Who approved the contracts, who ignored the warnings in internal reports, who signed the checks while ordinary families struggle with higher costs and stagnant wages. It was a kind of direct demand that no official wanted to face, because accountability in Washington often disappears into committees, subcommittees, and endless layers of bureaucracy. But Kennedy wasn't asking for a process. He was demanding responsibility. The officials tried to push back again, falling back on the phrase systemic issues. But Kennedy turned that phrase into a weapon. If it's systemic, he asked, then isn't that proof the entire system is broken? Isn't that exactly why the people no longer trust you? It was a devastating reversal. The very excuse they used to protect themselves was now the evidence Kennedy used to expose them. The longer the exchange went on, the clearer it became that the old defenses no longer worked. Every attempt to spin was dismantled. Every excuse sounded hollow. Kennedy wasn't just exposing individuals. He was exposing mechanics of an entire machine that had been running unchecked for far too long. By the end of the exchange, the hearing room felt different. The polished authority of the officials had vanished, replaced with a sense of vulnerability. Kennedy's calm, relentless questioning had left them exposed, their credibility in tatters. The system they represented, once seen as untouchable, now looked fragile, held together not by truth or service to the people, but by carefully crafted illusions that had just been torn apart live on camera. And Kennedy was only getting started to be why now. The cracks in the system weren't just visible, they were gaping holes. The officials sitting across from Senator Kennedy had lost control of the narrative. Their strategies of denial, technical language, and bureaucratic smokescreens had all been dismantled. But Kennedy wasn't satisfied with merely exposing contradictions. He was ready to push the confrontation further. This was no longer about asking tough questions. This was about forcing the system to face itself, live and unedited, in front of millions of viewers. Kennedy leaned forward again. His voice dropped into a steady, deliberate tone. He asked a question that sliced through the room like a blade. If the system is working, then why are the people you claim to serve worse off every single year? The words hit harder than any statistic. For years, Washington had promised growth, prosperity, and opportunity. Yet ordinary Americans were drowning in debt, struggling with health care, and watching their communities hollow out. The question wasn't just directed at the officials in the room. It was aimed at the very foundation of the political establishment. The officials tried to regain ground. One cited economic fluctuations. Another pointed to global pressures. But Kennedy didn't let them hide behind abstract explanations. He cut them off with specific examples. Towns where jobs had vanished. Families who couldn't afford basic necessities. Veterans who were promised care, but received nothing but waiting lists. His words painted a picture so vivid that viewers at home could see themselves reflected in it. He wasn't speaking as a senator in Washington. He was speaking as the voice of the people who had been ignored. The confrontation escalated when Kennedy revealed something that had been whispered in political circles, but rarely said aloud on camera. The system wasn't broken by accident. It was working exactly as designed. The inefficiencies, the favoritism, the endless loopholes, they weren't flaws, they were features. They existed to keep power concentrated in the hands of few, while convincing the public that everything was simply too complicated to change. For a moment, the officials froze. They knew the cameras were capturing every expression, every hesitation. And Kennedy didn't waste a moment. He pressed again. If the American people knew that the system isn't failing by mistake, but failing on purpose, do you really think they'd still trust any of you? That line became the pivot point. The journalists in the room knew. They were witnessing a headline that would dominate the news cycle. The officials knew they had been cornered, and the viewers at home felt a wave of recognition, confirmation of suspicions they had carried for years. What made Kennedy's confrontation so devastating was his composure. He wasn't shouting or grandstanding. He spoke with calm precision, as though he had rehearsed this moment for years. Every word was measured, every fact backed by evidence. That restraint made the confrontation more powerful than anger ever could. It wasn't the noise of a politician trying to make a scene. It was a silence of truth settling into the room, undeniable and heavy. By the end of his exchange, Kennedy had accomplished something rare. He had shifted the burden of proof. The officials weren't defending policies anymore. They were defending the very legitimacy of the system itself. And the more they tried to justify it, the more transparent their motives became. For once, the power dynamics had flipped. The system, long protected by layers of process and performance, was on the defensive, and it was John Kennedy who had put it there. And yet, Kennedy wasn't finished. Exposure and confrontation were only the beginning. What came next would strike at the core of how power operates in America, and would leave the entire establishment scrambling to contain the fallout up until this point. Kennedy had used sharp questions and precise logic to strip away the protective layers surrounding the officials. But what he did next went beyond exposing hypocrisy. It was a revelation of a trail, a map of how influence and money flowed through the system. And he didn't bring it up in passing. He laid it out step by step, like a prosecutor building a case for the jury. Kennedy pulled out another folder, thicker than the first. The camera zoomed in as he flipped it open, revealing highlighted pages and printed charts. These weren't vague accusations. They were records, contracts, timelines, and donations that formed a pattern too clear to dismiss. For years, certain corporations had been receiving lucrative government deals. At the same time, those same corporations had quietly funneled millions into campaign funds, think tanks, and lobbying efforts. The cycle was perfect. Public money went out, private money came back in, and the system kept feeding itself. The first official tried to object, claiming that the contract had gone through legal bidding processes. Kennedy cut him off instantly. "Then explain," he said, tapping one of the documents, "why the same company failed its project 3 times but still received extensions worth hundreds of millions of dollars? And explain why their largest donation to your department's oversight committee came just weeks before those extensions were approved." The room fell silent again. Kennedy wasn't theorizing. He was proving. Each page of his evidence trail connected us that the public had always suspected, but never seen laid out so plainly. It wasn't just mismanagement. It was a network of insiders protecting each other, feeding each other, and leaving taxpayers to foot the bill. What made it even more powerful was the way Kennedy explained it. He avoided the trap of technical jargon, instead breaking it down in plain, unmistakable terms. Viewers at home didn't need advanced degrees to follow the story. They could see it clearly. Politicians received donations, corporations received contracts, and accountability disappeared. The officials fumbled for responses. One leaned heavily on the phrase, industry standard. Another suggested that the evidence Kennedy presented was taken out of context. But Kennedy was ready for that too. He produced testimony from whistleblowers, workers inside those very corporations who had warned about waste, fraud, and inflated costs. Their warnings had been ignored, their reports buried. Kennedy read excerpts aloud, each one painting a picture of negligence and corruption ignored by those who were supposed to enforce accountability. The impact was devastating. This wasn't just about one contract, one department, or even one administration. It was systemic. It was cultural. It was the way Washington had operated for decades, normalized to the point where no one even questioned it anymore. Kennedy's evidence trail forced everyone watching to confront a simple but explosive truth. The system wasn't failing people by accident. It was being hijacked on purpose. Outside the room, the clips went viral. Social media erupted as users posted side-by-side screenshots of Kennedy's evidence, creating their own threads and explanations. News outlets scrambled to reframe their coverage, shifting from usual sanitized summaries to the story of a senator taking on the system live. For once, the narrative wasn't being controlled by insiders. It was being written by the people who were finally seeing the truth. By the time Kennedy closed the folder, the hearing no longer felt like an official proceeding. It felt like a trial, and the system itself was a defendant. The evidence trail he had laid out couldn't be spun away with excuses or hidden behind jargon. It was clear, undeniable, and damning. And Kennedy wasn't stopping there. The next step would be even more dangerous, for he was about to turn his words not only against the officials of the room, but against the large machinery of politics itself. The evidence trail Kennedy presented had already shaken the room, but he wasn't finished. Exposing corrupt contracts and backroom deals was only part of the story. Now he was ready to tackle the uncomfortable truth most senators, representatives, and officials never wanted aired. The politicians themselves weren't bystanders in this system. They were active participants. Kennedy began with a simple statement. This problem doesn't stop at the bureaucrats or the corporations. It runs through this very building. The words landed like a hammer. For years, Americans had suspected that lawmakers were tied to the same networks of influence they were supposed to regulate, but rarely had someone inside the system pointed directly at Congress itself while the cameras were rolling. He explained how legislation often arrived at the Senate floor not as a product of independent drafting, but already laced with language written by lobbyists. He cited instances where bills included entire paragraphs lifted word for word from industry proposals. Then he asked, calmly but firmly, if the people elected us to write their laws, why are corporations writing them instead? The question hung in the air. None of the officials could answer it because the truth was too clear. Kennedy pressed on, naming specific examples where massive donations to political campaigns were followed by sudden, favorable votes. He reminded the audience that these weren't coincidences. They were transactions, and every transaction came at the expense of the American people. What made Kennedy's revelation sting even more was that he didn't spare himself from criticism. He admitted openly that the culture Washington had tempted and consumed many who entered with good intentions. This town doesn't corrupt you all at once, he said, his voice steady. It does it in small steps, one favor here, one compromise there, until you don't even realize the people you came here to serve have been left behind. That honesty made his words more powerful. Viewers watching at home didn't see just another senator grandstanding. They saw someone acknowledging his own proximity to the very corruption he was exposing. Kennedy wasn't separating himself from the system. He was indicting it from within. The reaction in the hearing room was visceral. Staffers whispered nervously. Officials shifted in their chairs. Even some of Kennedy's colleagues, watching from the sidelines, looked stunned. Few politicians dared to challenge the system so directly, because everyone knew what came next: retaliation. Exposing corporate contract was one thing, but calling out fellow lawmakers threatened the fragile truce that kept Washington running. But Kennedy didn't stop. He pointed to the revolving door between politics and business. The way lawmakers who left office often became lobbyists, cashing in on the very connections they had built while in power. He called it a system that rewards failure, where politicians could betray the public trust and still walk away richer than before. The officials had no defense. What could they say? The evidence was public record. The donations, the votes, the post office lobbying jobs, all of it was documented. The difference was that Kennedy was willing to say it aloud, on camera, in language that ordinary Americans could understand. And that was the key. Kennedy wasn't just exposing corruption to a room full of insiders. He was speaking directly to the American people. He wanted them to see that the betrayal they felt wasn't paranoia. It was real, measurable, and intentional. By the time he finished, the room was no longer just tense. It was electric. The viewers at home weren't watching a senator ask questions anymore. They were watching a man dismantle mythology of American politics in real time. Kennedy knew that speaking these truths came with a cost, but he also knew that once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. And in the next final step, he would drive home the conclusion that left the system scrambling to respond, a direct challenge to the future of American governance itself. Be why the time Kennedy reached the end of his questioning, the hearing had transformed into something far larger than anyone had anticipated. What began as a routine session had turned into a public unmasking of Washington's inner machinery. The officials looked drained, their once polished defenses reduced to stammers and half-answers. The journalists in the room were glued to every word, knowing this was no ordinary political theater. It was a rare moment when the truth slipped through the cracks. And millions of viewers watching from home could sense that history was being made live before their eyes. Kennedy sat back for a moment, letting the weight of everything he had revealed settle into the room. Then, in his slow, deliberate way, he delivered the final blow. "The truth is simple," he began. "This system doesn't need more hearings, more reports, or more excuses. It needs accountability. It needs honesty. And above all, it needs to remember that it was built to serve the people, not itself." It was a line that cut across party lines, across ideologies, across excuses. Kennedy wasn't just addressing the officials sitting across from him. He was addressing every lawmaker, every bureaucrat, every lobbyist who had treated politics as a business rather than a responsibility. His words carried the quiet force of someone who understood the risks of saying them, but chose to say them anyway. He reminded the room that government was not a playground for the wealthy or a chessboard for corporations. It was a trust handed over by ordinary citizens who expected their leaders to protect them, not exploit them. And if that trust was broken, the entire system would eventually collapse under the weight of its own corruption. Then he turned directly to the cameras, breaking the invisible barrier between Washington and the people watching at home. This system counts on you not paying attention, he said. It counts on you believing that nothing can change. But today you've seen the truth with your own eyes. What you do with it, whether you demand better, whether you hold us accountable, that will decide the future of this country. The effect was electrifying. Viewers weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants. Kennedy had pulled them into the story, giving them a role in what came next. It wasn't just about one senator exposing corruption. It was about whether the people would allow the system to continue unchallenged. The officials sat frozen, powerless to respond. What could they say to counter such a direct appeal to the public? Any attempt at spin would look pathetic against the weight of Kennedy's closing strike. The silence in the room was louder than any rebuttal. Outside the chamber, the impact was immediate. Clips of Kennedy's words spread across social media like wildfire. Hashtags trended. Commentators debated whether this was the beginning of a seismic shift or just another moment that would fade into Washington's endless news cycle. But for the people who had watched it live, it didn't feel like just another hearing. It felt like a turning point. Kennedy didn't gloat. He didn't declare victory. Instead, he closed his folder, thanked the chair, and stood to leave. The simplicity of his exit made the moment even more powerful. He had said what needed to be said, and nothing more. The cameras followed him as he walked out, capturing the image of a man who had just taken on the system, and, at least for a moment, forced it to face the truth. That day would be remembered not because one senator embarrassed a panel of officials, but because he did what so few dared to do. He tore away the curtain and showed the American people exactly how the system really worked. And once exposed, it could never be unseen.